this is the panel about dreaming an American dream and whether it's a wise thing to do it, to dream it or not. Matthew Covey and Jarek Szubrycht, who's replacing Michał Hajduk, who was unable to attend because he is ill. So this is a slight change in the lineup of the panel, but this shouldn't change the quality of it. So please welcome Matthew and Jarek.
Good afternoon. Hello.
Hello, thank you very much for joining us. I'm just standing, so don't blame me. And anyway, Matthew is doing all the work here. Matthew is the founding member of Tamizdat, a non-profit organization that facilitates international cultural exchange, and we're going to learn what does it exactly mean and how can that help you. Let's start from your personal history with cultural exchange, because it started in Slovakia in the 90s, right?
That's true. Along with many Americans, I joined the diaspora from the US into Central Europe right after the wall came down, seeking adventure and fortune. For us at the time, it seemed like Paris in the 20s. This is the place every aspiring American 20-year-old novelist and musician wanted to go to Prague or to Krakow. So I joined this crowd of people. I went to teach at a small university in Slovakia, and it took me about 5 days in Trenčín before I realized that being in a band was a whole lot more interesting than teaching. So ended up in a band. We played, signed to a Slovak record label, put out one album in Slovakia, relocated to Ireland for a year, and then moved back to New York and worked there for about another 6 years before it became too tiring to keep doing. But in the process, the band, the members of the band formed Tamizdat initially as a way to help Central and Eastern European independent, non-commercial artists find audiences in Western Europe and in the US. It was a really fun, interesting, cool idea. It was not a very profitable idea, it turned out. But it set us on the road toward a really long project as we started to think more and more carefully about what is the importance of cultural exchange and how does the movement of artists across borders, across continents, across oceans, how does that affect society, and how does that what does that mean, and what is the importance of that kind of mobility? So now I have two entities. There's Tamizdat, which is a nonprofit cultural advocacy organization, and a number of years ago, largely in response to the ever worsening political situation in the US, we created a law firm out of Tamizdat, which is an immigration law firm, which now handles visas on a more commercial level, but also works a lot with non-commercial artists, bringing about 4,000 performing artists, musicians, actors, dancers, circus artists into the US each year. So on the one hand, it's an advocacy program. On the other hand, I'm very involved we handle most of the visas for South by Southwest. We work with the big agencies, the big record labels, a lot of the big studios, and we're very involved with all of their work bringing artists into the US. So while the little piece that we're involved with is the immigration piece, getting visas for people, that connects to everything else. It connects to the contracts, to the management, tour routing, the licensing of materials. So we kind of get a piece of everything involved in this process.
And being a recording and touring artist, and then also a booking agent and a band manager, I figure experienced the problems by yourself that you kind of figure out you can try to solve as well. So what kind of problems there were in the 90s, and are these the same problems that we have now?
On a very basic level, yeah, in the sense that the problem for artists is always from a labor point of view, artists are the riveters on the factory floor of the culture industry, and it's always hard riveting. Does that make sense? So it's like they are the workers on the floor. And so it's always hard for workers to get paid. It's always hard for workers to make a fair salary. So that hasn't changed, but I also don't think it's changed at any point in history. The people who make the money are generally the bosses. So that hasn't changed. The ways this plays out, especially with the increase of streaming, which at least for now has made it harder for artists to make money from recordings, has really focused, especially in the US, on the importance of touring. If you're not touring, it's very hard to make a living. That's been a change. But at the same time, technology has really empowered a lot of artists to be able to work outside of the big studio, the big label, the big management company systems. It's easier to approach media because there's a lot more media. It's not as focused, but there's a lot more media to work with. So for an artist who's determined to be independent, I don't know if it's easier, but there's a lot more options.
But why do they do that? I mean, why do American bands put a lot of effort and energy to try to make it on the European markets, and then why do Europeans try to make it in America? I mean, these are all like big markets. It's good to have like markets in Europe for like Polish band. Why try and face these all obstacles to get into the United States?
That was two questions. Why do European artists or American artists come here, and why do European artists go there? They're very different. I think American artists come here for a variety of reasons. One, for certain kinds of art, there's more money in Europe. So for world music groups, for groups that are functioning in sort of outside of the mainstream, there's much more cultural funding in Europe than there is in the US. So you can, if you're a klezmer group, you can get paid to play a big festival in some small town, and you're making money that you could never dream of making in the US. And they also pay for your hotel, which never happens in the US. And they might even give you dinner, unheard of. So that's one reason. Beyond that, for larger artists, I think there's just a question of where your market is. There are artists in specific genres that they're going to find audiences in Europe that are harder to find in the US. And that just is very specific on where there's where there's a group of people, there's a critical mass of people who like a kind of music, or it might just simply be as simple as there's a journalist who likes a specific artist and starts writing about them in Poland, and then suddenly you realize you can sell 300 tickets in Poznań where you can't sell 300 tickets in Los Angeles. So I'm going to go to Poznań. So that happens. Now, the other direction, that's more mysterious to me, why Europeans go to the US. Obviously, I work with thousands of artists who do this every year. And it's interesting because, especially for new artists, we often have a conversation about their motivation. Why are you doing this? Why do you want to go to South by Southwest? Why do you want to set up that first tour? And the answers I get in these conversations vary widely. A lot of people, I guess this sort of comes to the topic here. It seems like artists vary dramatically in how realistic they are about what they're trying to achieve. If you want to go because it's an adventure and it's super interesting and it's exciting and it feeds your ego or in some great way, that's a perfectly good reason to do this. It doesn't mean you're going to make any money, and it doesn't mean you're going to become rich and famous and be hanging out, with Morrissey on the beach in Santa Monica. That's not necessarily going to happen, but you certainly could have an interesting experience. If you're doing it because you're trying to move your career forward, that's a much more complex strategic question, and often a much slower question. So I'm going to speak a little bit about the second one, which is when you're trying to really do this as part of a career move. I think that there's a couple of realities about the US that are hard to, and Canada, I'll loop Canada into this to a certain extent, although it is a sort of different market in a way. It's a very difficult market to enter. The amount of space is very large, so touring is difficult. The first time I brought a Polish band, the name of which will remain unmentioned here, they were playing in Austin on a concert we arranged, and they looked at the cost of a flight from Poland to New York, or the cost of a flight from Poland to New York to Austin, and it was much more to Austin, so they decided to rent a car in New York and drive to Austin. Not realizing, I guess, that that was a 22-hour drive. So by the time they got to Austin, it was 1 hour before their concert. So it's really, really big. And touring is really, really, unless you're going along the East Coast or to a certain extent along the West Coast and you're just staying on the coasts, there's so much space that it's very hard to cover much territory. So that's one reason it's difficult. The other reason it's difficult is, well, there's a bunch of them. Touring artists are treated really poorly for the most part, especially early in their careers. The money is terrible. Getting a hotel in your deal is pretty uncommon. You might get some pizza, but that's also not necessarily going to happen. So people are treated pretty badly initially. If you can make it through the first few tours and so you actually start developing an audience, it gets better. But initially, you're sleeping on floors and sleeping in the van. I'm talking about rock music for the most part, and less so for electronic music, and certainly less so for classical music. I'm assuming most of this is, we don't have a lot of classical musicians here. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay, great. That's a totally different world. So that's a reason it's difficult. I think there's a number of other reasons. But obviously the one that I work on most is visas. The visa situation is very complex and very difficult and expensive and slow. And it really makes it difficult for emerging artists to just kind of say, I'm just going to go and do a tour. This sounds like fun, why not do it? Maybe I'll make some money. Chances are once you've paid for the visas and the flights, there's no way you could possibly make that money back. So that's depressing. I think that I've worked with a number of bands who just have decided that there's an important market, and the way they strategize is they just say, look, I'm going to do a tour in the US every 6 months for 3 years. We're going to do 6 tours. The first tour, we're going to totally lose money. Hopefully the second tour will lose less. Hopefully the third tour will lose less. Maybe by the 5th tour, we might break even. By the 6th tour, we hope to make money. But that's a lot of work. That's a huge amount of work. And a lot of money. It's a big investment. And that's, if you're willing to put that kind of work into it, then it can make sense. Otherwise, unless you have something miraculous happen, like you get a sync license in a Marvel comic television show or something like that, and suddenly everybody knows who you are, it's going to be tricky to make that work. The other piece that's really important, am I talking too much? Okay, I guess that's what I'm here for, right? Okay, so it's fine. The other piece that's really important is it's very difficult, I guess this is anywhere, but it's certainly very difficult to enter the US market without a team, without having people in place to help you. And this really becomes very clear at the showcase events, so like at South by Southwest. if you're an artist and you just sort of show up in Texas and think that that's going to change your career somehow, it probably won't. The chances that your performance, it turns out it's in some taco shop at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and there's maybe going to be 3 people there. And you've just flown, 6,000 kilometers to play to 3 people in a taco shop. That's really frustrating. If you want to make anything you do in the US functional, you need to have a team in place. And I think that's certainly what the music export organizations are working to do, is try to figure out how can you be connected with a publicist, with a manager, probably not initially, but with some organizations there who have infrastructure in place to help fit you in to an existing system so that you land running rather than you just land. Does that make sense?
There's one factor you didn't mention is the audience. I mean, is American audience even interested in foreign bands? Are American media interested in foreign bands? I guess it varies from genre to genre, but
it does.
Generally.
Yeah, it does. This also is a little bit tough. If you're doing R&B, it's really going to be hard to get an American audience to be interested in Polish R&B, just because we have a lot. We're pretty good at it, and we don't generally think that we need to go to Poland to get more. Whereas there's other genres. I mean, this is probably the reason when I think through Polish artists who've made it in the US, who've made an impact, oftentimes it will be more of a world music group because they're bringing something with them that that isn't competing with everything else that's on the market. I sometimes think about like Polish punk music from the from the 90s, where bands like Klinika, you know Klinika? Yeah, we're using violin. That's right? They had a violin? Is that true?
Yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. Like that, there was the scene both in Hungary and Poland where there was this amazing kind of hard punk that tended to be mixing in elements of traditional music. And I'm sort of surprised that never went anywhere outside of this region, because I thought it was really interesting, and I also thought it was much more marketable than just another, hardcore band that, in this case, is singing in a language that I don't understand. But I think it's important, unless you're really, really amazingly good, it's really hard to compete with in a genre where you kind of sound a lot like everyone else.
You've mentioned South by Southwest, which is like considered here as a main point of entry to American market. Is it really? And who can benefit from visiting South by Southwest? Is it like a good way for everybody?
Yes and no. It's huge. It's so big, it's really hard to imagine how big it is if you've never been there. And in that way, being lost it will happen. It's hard to imagine how you can't get there and just be like, whoa, what the hell? But it is where the industry is, and it is, for international artists, it's fairly clear that is an accepted entry point within rock music, within a lot of electronic music. There are other entry points, but they are more genre specific, like the Winter Music Conference in Miami is a perfectly useful conference for entering if you're doing electronic dance music related work. That's a good entry point. There are a couple of others depending on what kind of genre you're in. Like there's the Folk Alliance conference. If you're working in folk music, it's great. I've seen some Polish bands make a really significant impact at Folk Alliance. So that moves around. That's in New Orleans next year. This year it was in Montreal. It's often in Kansas City. So that's a great one. But South by Southwest is probably for popular music really the entry point. So on the one hand, everyone is there. You can learn an enormous amount just by being there, but you probably will be a fairly small fish in a very big ocean when you're there. I often tell artists that if they're independent and they're not working much with a management company or they're not signed to a label, that if they really want to go, send one person from your band, the most business-oriented person from your band, send them this year to just attend, just to see what's going on. And if they come home and say, yeah, that's totally worth doing, we can make this work, then put the money into bringing the rest of the band. But just but trying to bring the band over the first time and do it yourself is really a very large financial gamble, because it very likely won't get you anywhere. It might. That's the amazing thing about it. Every year, there's enough artists. Last year, I remember I was on the street and some friend said, hey, there's this band from Belfast playing. You got to see them, they're great. And I got there, and they were amazing. They were incredible. And they were probably 21, 22 years old, something like that. And I walked out behind, and I saw them leaving the back into the alley behind the club. And I saw Marty Diamond, who's probably the most important US booking agent, walking up to them. And obviously, he was signing them. So that was like 10 minutes after their show. That what they came for was done. But for every story like that, there's 1,000 bands who go play in the taco shop and then go home and say, why did I bother? Now, one more piece on this though. It's become clear that simply performing in Austin at South by Southwest may not do you any good at all in the US, but you may be able to get a bunch of press in Poland about the fact that you went. And that's fine. That's another perfectly good reason to go. You just don't want people to find out that no one saw your show in Poland or in Texas. So if you can keep that, like maybe don't bring the camera crew with you, because you don't want that getting into the Polish media, but you can certainly make a really good story about that. And I think it also helps with a lot of artists who, because of the style they're in, maybe can't reach a very large Polish, like if you're, if it's unlikely that the Polish market is going to take you very seriously, because like you're a post-rock band and you're mostly instrumental, and who's going to pay attention to you here? But suddenly you get into South by Southwest, and that tastemaker, they sprinkle the magic dust on you, and suddenly the media here thinks, oh, you must be really cool, so they start writing about it. There's all kinds of political, social problems to this dynamic, but it functions that way.
Let's talk a little bit more about Time Is That. What exactly do you do apart from discouraging the small fishes from,
Not discouraging, it's a matter of being realistic. Time Is That works in the field that has come to be called cultural mobility. So part of the reason I'm here today is because yesterday I was in Prague at a conference of European Union cultural organizations that are all working on the issues of funding for international arts and visa problems. A lot of the work we're working on right now has to do with Brexit and figuring out what's going to happen to EU artists when they need to go to the UK after Brexit. So there's a lot of political issues like that. In the US, as you may have heard, we have a really terrible president right now. And we are working, so a lot of the work we are doing is in response to that. And by in response to, I mean trying to figure out ways to keep the culture in the US connected with the rest of the world. You may have heard that the first thing that our current president did when he took office was create an immigration wall against people coming to the US from a number of different Muslim majority countries. So the first thing we did was start to figure out how can we get through that wall. with artists. So we were successful in getting. It is. It's basically if you're from Libya, if you're from Somalia, if you're from Iran, you can't get a visa to the U.S. It's impossible. Or so it seemed until we were able to get the first exception. We found a way to get through the wall for a Syrian dancer to come and perform in Cincinnati, and that led to a whole series of other exceptions where the legal community in the US is working to try to figure out how to keep the wall from keeping worthy people out. So we do a lot of that work. When things get really bad and we have to sue the US government, then we sue the US government. So we do a lot of work along those lines and a lot of education work like you're seeing today.
Did this Trump administration thing hurt any other countries as well? I mean, you said about the Muslim ones, but did it made any change for like Europeans?
Yeah, very much so. Less so for Europeans, or certainly less so for Western Europeans. There are two phases, there's two parts to the process of getting a visa. Oh, you know what? I need to stop for a second and explain something. Part of the reason that the showcase events are important for new artists is because, especially South by Southwest, but the other large ones as well, it's legal to perform at them without getting a working visa. And this is really important because you can spend $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 getting a working visa to perform in the US. And so if you can play at a showcase event and start the beginning pieces of your music career in that market without having to spend $4,000 to get a working visa, that's really important. So, you know, you could go and book a small tour of cool little venues, like American bands would if they were trying to enter the Polish market. You just find like, these are 12 cool clubs. I'll just play 12 shows in 2 weeks. That's perfect. But if you want to do that in the US, you'd have to start by paying $2,000 to $4,000 to get a working visa to do that tour, which obviously is more money than you're probably going to make on the tour, so that is not viable. Whereas, if you can go and play South by Southwest, then you avoid that expense. What was your question? Yeah. Okay. So, if you get past the showcase point in the process and you are starting to do tours, then you do need a working visa. And to get a working visa, there's two pieces to the process. The first part is a work authorization, and that hasn't really been affected very much by Trump. That's just kind of, are you famous enough, and do you actually have work? It doesn't really matter if you also are a member of Al-Qaeda, or you have a drug record, or it doesn't really matter. It just, are you a musician that's famous, and do you have work? Then the second piece is the piece that happens when you apply for a visa at a US embassy, and that has changed enormously. It's become much more difficult, partly because the US Department of State is very, very dysfunctional right now in many ways. And there's been a big loss of expertise throughout the system. So when problems happen, things are slow, things are inefficient, mistakes get made a lot, computer systems crash. It's not the priority of the new administration, so it just doesn't work very well. It's also, not so much in Europe, but in other parts of the world, the racial and ethnic profiling has become much stronger. If you're a band from Ghana and you've got 10 people in the band and 3 of them are female and 50 years old and 5 of them are male and 22 years old, the 3 50-year-old females will get visas. The 5 22-year-old males will not, because it is perceived that why would a 22-year-old man from Ghana go to the US for any reason other than to immigrate illegally? So they're not going to get a visa. So that's new, and that's become very problematic. Not so much for Polish people so far. You never know.
Do you think is there any chance that this visa process in the US will become less sophisticated and above all more predictable? I mean, instead of finding the holes in the system, like for every other example. Maybe it would be better to kind of, I don't know, lobby to change the procedures, the law.
We are doing a lot of lobbying work, and we work with a bunch of organizations that do that work to try to make the process better. In the current administration, I'm not very hopeful. We have a lot of immigration problems in the US, and I don't think the concerns of musicians are the top of that list. I think children in cages in New Mexico is probably a bigger issue. But nevertheless, we are working on it. We created a study which really digs into a lot of the problems. I presented it in Brussels to the Secretary of Culture. Is that who it is? I guess so, in Brussels. They're very interested. So there's a lot of work within the EU and within the US to try to put pressure on the US government to make this process better. I would say in English, I am not holding my breath that it's going to happen, that there's going to be much change in the next couple of years.
Okay, let's say I'm like a band manager or a band member that is would like to fulfill its American dream, and I'm approaching time is that how should I be prepared for what should I be prepared for? What should I know before doing that?
In the sense that I want to, you're coming to me because you want to come to the US. Do you already have a tour booked or a performance booked?
Yeah, I've got like
okay, cool.
Invitation from South by Southwest.
Okay, perfect. That's fantastic. Well, the first thing I would say to you is if you've got the invitation from South by Southwest and you come to me and say, what do? I would say, you're kind of okay. You don't need a visa. You're good. Don't book other shows because then you would need a visa.
If I book like 2-3 shows, it's
you're out. Then legally you need you need a work visa, which is really frustrating because in reality, South by Southwest tends to give people one official showcase, but as is quite famous, bands tend to play 3 to 20 shows in 3 days during South by Southwest. And the tendency is that none of those are official. Well, one of them is official, and all the other ones are unofficial. So technically, those aren't legal. In reality, what that can mean is if you arrive at the airport and have your invitation from South by Southwest that says, look, this is legal, it's okay. And then the officer Googles your name and sees that you're playing 12 other shows, that's when people can get turned away. It doesn't happen very often, but when it does happen, it's really bad. So that's a concern.
As soon as I cross the border, I'm all right. I mean, if there is someone that is...
Once you're in the U.S., you're fine. I mean, I'm going to regret having said that, but in general, you're fine. It's not like immigration, customs, and enforcement police are going to rock clubs to find bands that are playing for pizza. Like, that's not the priority. But it is, you do need to be careful because if you do tour and what bands typically want to do is they want to land and do some shows on the way to Texas and back. That makes all the sense in the world. If it is discovered that that's what you're doing, though, you will probably be denied entry to the U.S. The other problem is, say that tour goes really, really well, and you get a bunch of press, and everything's amazing, and so then you go a year later to apply for your work visa because you've got a real tour, and you have to delete all that information about those shows. You can't use the press from those successes because you're submitting to the U.S. government proof that you violated your visa. That's a bad idea. So this is something that happens sometimes. We'll get an artist who's been living in Los Angeles for 5 years illegally, developing their career, and they're like, finally get to the point where like, yeah, I can get a visa now. It's like, no, you can't, because everything you've done has been illegal. So you can't use any of that evidence to get the work visa. It's very depressing.
Okay, so I'm not invited by Southwest, but I've got like a small tour on the East Coast, and because I have like a small American label or something. And what do I do now? I mean, I've never been to US before.
Okay. So in that situation, you're going to have to get a visa. you're going to have to get help, basically. Now, your U.S. label may know how to do this, so they might connect you with an agency or an attorney that does that work. The process, ideally, you'd want to start the process 4 or 5 months before the tour starts. You're going to need to be able to prove your career successes so far. You're going to need to be able to show the contracts for your performances. It's a lot of work. It's generally, we would say, if you're to the point in your career that someone wants to bring you to the US to perform, then you're probably at a point in your career where you will be eligible for a visa. It's rare, though it does happen, that an artist comes to us and says, I really, really want to tour in the US. And we look at their materials, and it's clear they really don't have any career at all to speak of. And then they're not going to be eligible for a visa. It's just not going to work. It happens a lot right now with artists from Brazil. We have all these artists, because everybody's trying to leave Brazil for obvious reasons, especially artists. And so we're getting a lot of people who are kind of local stars in smaller markets, and they're trying to come to the US. And there's very little we can do for them, because they're not at a level where America needs them, I guess, is sort of the way the law is set up. Am I talking too quickly? It's all right? Okay, good. Sorry if I am.
Time is quite a crucial factor here. I mean, because I'm like, small band, and this show at the American Festival is standing. So we've got informed that we can play like 3 months before the show, or 2 months before the show. Are we gonna make it? Is there any way to make things quicker?
Yeah, there is. It's expensive. And this is where there are expediting fees that you can pay to the government, to the unions. Okay, actually, here's a moment of self-promotion. I'm doing another workshop in an hour or so on the real detail, the legal details of the visa process. So if that's something, is that open? Can people just go to that? 10 more places. Okay. So if that's something you really, like, if you're planning to go to the US and this is something that's coming up in the next year and you really, you need to know the nuts and bolts of it, then that would be the best place to get it. But to your question generally, there's a lot of parts that go into this, and it's best to start about 4 months in advance. But if, you get, say, some amazing hot band that's super, I'm trying to think of a band that's all hot right now. Like Fontaine's DC comes through Poland, and your band plays for them, opens for them in Krakow, and you guys have an amazing night together hanging out, and they're like, hey, do you guys want to open for us on the second leg of the Midwest tour in the US? We're leaving in 3 weeks. And you're like, wow, this is huge. And your label here says, okay, you know what, this is great. We have a distribution thing we can put in place with Thrill Jockey Records in Chicago. We're going to get an advance on this. This is great. Money doesn't matter. Let's make this happen. Yeah, you can probably, the money doesn't matter part is probably the most important part of that conversation. Yeah, if you're willing to pay expediting fees and an enormous amount of work in, did I say 3 weeks? Let's make that 4 weeks. If you're willing to put an enormous amount of work into 4 weeks, you could probably join Fontaine's DC at, in Chicago for that stretch of the tour. But it's going to be very, very stressful, and you're going to want to make sure your manager is really, really organized, or it's not going to work.
We've got our visas, we've got the work permits and the plane tickets. Is that all? I mean, crossing the American border is just a formality now?
If you've done everything right, yes. If you've got the work permit, which they call the petition, if you ever are digging into it, it's confusing. If you've got the work authorization, you've got the visa, you didn't lie about your criminal record, then yeah, the formality is fine. Where people run into problems at the border is when they've lied about something or are confused about something. The most tragic one, I'm going to say, this is a little bit from what I'll be talking about in an hour, but I'm going to say this right now because it bears repeating at every single session. The most tragic, common problem we see is an artist books a show in the US and decides in their mind that because they are not getting paid, they don't need a work visa. And so they show up with their amplifiers and their guitars at JFK in New York and say, "Hi, I'm here to play a show." And the officer says, "Well, where's your work visa?" And they say, "It's okay because I'm not getting paid." And the officer says, "That's not a rule, you made that up." And they send them home. There's a reason for this, and this is the legal part of this conversation here. The legal reason, I'm going to tell you, just so you understand, so you can tell other people, so hopefully this will stop happening. The reason is because the rules, the US visa rules for artists are all to protect US musicians from you. So the idea is that unless you've got a really good reason to enter the US market, then this stuff should be done by a US musician. Okay, so it's protectionism. So if you think about playing a free concert from that point of view, then you realize, well, here's an example. Imagine, in Polish, how do you say a lumberjack? Somebody who chops down a tree. Yeah, okay, thank you. So imagine there's a bunch of lumberjacks in British Columbia, and they want to come across the border into Washington State to chop down trees, right? And they say to the government, "Can we do this?" And the government says, "No, you need a work visa to do that." So the lumberjacks say, "But we love chopping down trees. We love it so much that you don't have to pay us. We'll do it for free." That's okay, right? Well, no, the government would say, "Well, no, that's actually worse, because not only are you taking the jobs from US lumberjacks, but you're actually depressing the value of their labor." Okay, so when musicians come to the US to perform for free, that's the way US law looks at it. This is even worser, that's not a word, this is even worse than coming and playing and getting paid. So don't come thinking you're going to be fine if you're not getting paid, please. It's just not the way it works. That was really long, I'm sorry. Was that useful? I hope so.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is like the most common mistake or
Well, you asked about a problem at the border, and that's the most common problem at the border, is somebody coming thinking they're fine because they made up a new law for themselves.
I guess we're approaching the end of this conversation, but we still have some time for a couple of questions. All right.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Lucas. I got a question. With the political climate being shitty right now, do you see Tamizdat working with ACLU or other human rights organizations to kind of...
We already are.
You already are?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're working a lot with PEN International, which works with writers, and increasingly working with ACLU.
And how do you do that? Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
A lot of it's case-based, but we're advising, because we sue the government and ACLU sues the government, so we're kind of coordinating. We also work a lot with the American Immigration Lawyers Association. So when there's a problem, because what we do is very focused on the performing arts, there are situations that only make sense, that are only really relevant to who we work with. PEN doesn't really care. ACLU, they've got such bigger issues to worry about right now than performing artists. So there are some cases that kind of come to us, but because these things are all connected, we'll go to the ACLU for advice, and they can help us figure out how to make a strategy. Was that an answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Sorry, the ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union, which is a major progressive legal organization that exists in the US to fight against various civil liberties issues, usually within the government. They're very busy these days.
Any other questions, please?
Hi, I'm Piotr. I just want to ask, because I heard about it, is the truth that the artist or musician have to pay for the line checks, sound checks when approaching for the first time to States? I heard about it, like you're totally unknown artist and you're coming to States and you have to pay for the line check. Is that true?
I've never heard that. There are different models at venues. There are some venues that charge the artist to perform there. Usually what happens then is, you pay the venue a flat fee and then you take the money from the door. As a general rule, I would be careful of booking a show at a venue where you have to pay them. That's a bad sign. There might be a situation when it's worth it, but in general, there's probably a better venue in town that would have a better deal.
Sounds weird, yeah.
It definitely sounds weird.
Thanks.
But not specifically for a sound check or line check. That sounds, it's totally possible. There might be somebody out there, but that's super weird. Yeah. Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit this unofficial show system during South by? There are a couple bands from Poland playing South by every year, but none of them playing unofficial show. How to get to unofficial shows? How to play 14 shows in 3 days?
Well, that's a good question. That is when I was talking about your team. That has everything to do with it. Honestly, those shows come about really for an independent act, are really about their personal relationships. And, if Brooklyn Vegan did a review of your album because Red Distribution picked it up, and for some reason you sent a copy to somebody at the music department at Brooklyn, that's like an online music publication. It's kind of a hipster one. If you sent the CD or links, I guess that's what the kids do these days, if you sent the links to Brooklyn Vegan, they listened to it, and for some reason they liked it, then you start talking with that journalist. And then 4 months later, it's November, and you say, hey, Brooklyn Vegan, are you doing anything at South by Southwest? And they're like, yeah, we're doing a showcase. Let me see if we've got any openings on it. That's where that would come from. But also keep in mind that the Polish organizations, obviously, like Don't Panic would be, a great resource. They're there every year. They're involved with trying to make those connections for you, both through their own showcases and through their informal connections. So it's really just a matter of networking. There is no clearinghouse. There is no system for getting those showcases. It's just a matter of finding the people who are, and there's so many that if you try, there's going to be something that you can find. Was that an answer? Sort of? Not a very useful one, I know, but there you go. What?
Questions?
Okay, that's not a question, but that's all.
It's not a question, so thank you, Matthew, for taking our invitation. And I just wanted to say that if you're interested in a workshop that Matthew will be performing at 4 o'clock at NH Hotel, we have still 10 spots.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot.